The heat of the Georgia summer did not merely exist, it pooled. It collected in the still, foul water of the irrigation ditches and hung in the thick air beneath the live oaks, their Spanish moss like ragged shrouds. At Willow Creek Plantation, the sun was a malevolent eye, bleaching the columns of the great house to a blinding bone white. Inside, in the perpetual twilight of the parlor, the heat was a different beast. It was stifled by heavy velvet drapes, absorbed by dark mahogany, and sweetened to the point of nausea by the scent of magnolia blossoms arranged in porcelain vases. Here, the three women held their court. Mrs. Albright, the mistress of the house, possessed a stillness that was more threatening than any outburst, her smiles as cold and sharp as shards of ice. Her sisters, Lillian and Constance, were her pale echoes, their laughter a sound like dry bones rattling in a box. Their boredom was a tangible force, more corrosive than the humidity. And they had found their new diversion. His name was Elijah. He was a groom, chosen for the impossible sleekness of the horses he tended and the quiet, unnerving dignity with which he carried himself. To the ladies, he was a beautiful, unresponsive object, and their favorite game was to find the lever, the switch, the crack that would make him react. It began subtly. "Elijah, stand on that stool. Let us see how tall a man you are." He would stand, motionless for an hour, while they sipped iced tea and commented on his physique as if he were a statue. Then it escalated. "Elijah, recite the Lord's Prayer. Backwards." When he remained silent, they pretended to be scandalized, then delighted. They didn't know he could have done it perfectly, that he held words inside him like contraband. His hidden knowledge was his only true possession, and he would not give it to them. One afternoon, Mrs. Albright brought out a book. It was not a Bible or a novel, but a ledger, bound in fine, supple leather the color of a bloodstain that had been scrubbed and faded by time. "Bring him inside," she said, her voice smooth as oil. Elijah was made to stand on the intricate Persian rug, his bare feet sinking into the weave. The sisters arranged themselves on the settee, a tableau of pastel dresses and keen, hungry eyes. "Today," Mrs. Albright began, opening the ledger to a blank page, "we shall play a game of choice. Elijah, you will choose. You may take 10 strokes of the cane now, for no reason at all. Or, you may refuse, and little Samuel from the kitchens will take 20 for the sugar he was accused of stealing. What do you say?" The air left the room. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock. Elijah's eyes, which usually held the distant focus of a man looking at a far-off horizon, now fixed on Mrs. Albright. He saw the fine tracery of lines around her mouth, the absolute vacancy in her gaze. This was not a question. It was the first line of a new, terrible story, and she was already dipping her pen in the inkwell, ready to transcribe it into the clean, white pages of the book. He drew a breath, the air thick with the scent of magnolias and a cruelty so refined it had become a form of art. The story was beginning, and he was its living, breathing ink. The arrival of the new groom was an event meticulously orchestrated by the silent machinery of the plantation, yet it presented itself as a simple, practical necessity. The previous head groom, an old man named Joseph, had been carried off by a fever that burned through the slave quarters with a swift, impersonal fury, leaving a vacuum in the one area of the estate that demanded both brute strength and an almost preternatural calm. The master, largely absent in both body and spirit, had left the domestic affairs to his wife, and it was she who made the selection. Her choice fell upon Elijah, a man known for his way with the high-strung thoroughbreds imported from Virginia, animals of such nervous temperament and value that they were considered more fragile than the crystal in the main house's cabinets. Elijah possessed a quiet that was not submission, a physical presence that was both powerful and restrained, moving with an economy of motion that seemed to conserve not just energy but his very essence. When the order came for him to report to the main house, it was delivered with the usual casual brutality, but a ripple of something unspoken passed through the others who worked the fields, a mixture of pity, fear, and a grim knowingness. The main house was a different kind of field, one where the labor was not measured in rows of cotton picked but in the slow erosion of a man's spirit. Elijah himself felt the shift as he crossed from the packed dirt of the yard onto the immaculately swept veranda, the world changing from the raw, honest brutality of the sun to the shaded, perfumed oppression of the big house. He was brought into the parlor, not through the back entrance used for service, but through the main French doors, as if he were a specimen to be examined in the proper light. The three women were there, arranged like flowers in a vase, their silks and muslins a stark contrast to his rough, homespun shirt. Mrs. Albright's gaze was the first to land on him, a slow, appraising look that stripped him of his humanity and assessed him as a thing, a potentially interesting thing, but a thing nonetheless. Her sisters, Lillian and Constance, watched her first, then turned their identical, bird-like attention to him, their eyes bright with a vacant curiosity. He stood, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, the smell of horses and honest sweat clinging to him, an alien scent in that room of beeswax and decay. He was there because he was the best with the animals, but in that moment, he understood that he was now the new animal, the most complex and challenging one they had yet encountered, and the true nature of his new duties began to coil, cold and sinister, in the pit of his stomach. The air in the room was still, the women's silence a heavier weight than any overseer's shout. The first performance was not announced as such. It was draped in the languid, mundane language of privilege, a request so trivial to the asker that its profound cruelty was almost an afterthought. The afternoon was stifling, a heavy blanket of heat that pressed down on the manicured lawn, and the sisters, complaining of the lethargy it induced, sought a diversion. It was Constance, the youngest, who first gave the game its voice, pointing a pale, limp hand toward Elijah where he stood awaiting orders near the rose garden. "That one looks strong," she murmured. "I should think he could stir the very air if he tried." The idea, once seeded, took immediate and vicious root. Mrs. Albright, a faint, unnerving smile touching her lips, summoned him forward. The task, she explained, was a matter of household aesthetics. A particular old oak at the lawn's edge was casting an unsightly shadow, and a stone bench, long disused, needed to be relocated to a spot precisely where the shadow now fell. The bench was a solid, moss-flecked granite thing, its weight a known quantity to the groundskeepers, a burden for two men. Elijah approached it, his mind racing ahead of his body, already understanding the true nature of the test. He was to move it alone. The sisters arranged themselves on the veranda in wicker chairs, a small table between them holding glasses of sweet tea that perspired in the heat. As he bent his knees, set his back, and felt the immense, unyielding weight of the stone meet the muscles of his shoulders and legs, he became acutely aware of their gaze. It was not the watchfulness of an overseer judging efficiency, but the detached, analytical observation of spectators at a circus. He felt the strain in his tendons, the sharp intake of breath that was necessary to find the leverage, and the slow, grinding shift of the bench as it lifted from its impression in the earth. The journey across the lawn was an eternity, each step a small battle against gravity and the silent, screaming protest of his body. The women did not speak to one another, they simply watched, their eyes following his slow, agonizing progress. He could feel the sweat tracing paths through the dust on his skin, his breath coming in ragged gusts. When he finally reached the designated spot under the oak and lowered the bench with a final, shuddering exertion, the silence was broken not by dismissal, but by Lillian's light, conversational tone. "Oh, but I think it looks quite wrong there now. It blocks the view of the creep myrtles. It really ought to be moved back." Mrs. Albright nodded in agreement, her eyes still fixed on Elijah, noting the heaving of his chest, the slight tremble in his hands. "Indeed. It seems the original placement was correct. You will return it, Elijah." And so he turned, the shade of the great tree offering no respite, only the cold certainty that this was not about the bench, or the shadow, or the view. It was about the simple, brutal demonstration of a power so absolute it could command a man to perform a Herculean task for no reason other than to witness the effort, to see the sweat and the strain and to know that his body, his will, his very exhaustion, existed solely for their passing amusement. The discovery was an accident, a fleeting moment of inattention that unraveled a secret he had guarded as closely as his own life. It occurred during one of their increasingly elaborate and pointless tasks, this time involving the rearrangement of the entire library. The sisters, having read some frivolous account of a European salon, had decided the books ought to be organized not by subject or author, but by the color of their bindings, creating what they called a spectrum of knowledge. Elijah was tasked with the heavy lifting, moving the laden shelves while the women pointed and directed from their perches. In the midst of this chaos of leather and paper, a small, worn volume slipped from a high shelf he was clearing, falling to the floor and splaying open at his feet. It was a child's primer, long forgotten, its pages filled with simple alphabets and woodcut illustrations. Without thinking, driven by an instinct deeper than caution, his eyes scanned the open page, and he saw the word cat beneath the picture of the animal. A memory, sharp and clear as broken glass, surfaced from a stolen childhood moment with the plantation's old, long-dead tutor, a furtive, whispered lesson in a dusty loft. His lips, for a fraction of a second, moved silently, forming the shape of the letters. He did not know he was being watched. Mrs. Albright, from her chair by the window, had seen the entire sequence, the falling book, his arrested motion, the focused intensity in his eyes that was not the blankness of labor but the active engagement of a mind at work. She saw the faint, almost imperceptible movement of his lips. A slow, dreadful smile touched her mouth, a predator's smile. She did not speak of it then, allowing the charade of the colored spectrum to continue, but the knowledge settled inside her, a new and exquisite toy. Later that evening, when Elijah was brought before them for the day's final assessment, the atmosphere in the parlor had shifted. The casual cruelty was now charged with a sharp, intellectual curiosity. Elijah, Mrs. Albright began, her voice deceptively soft as she held up a slip of paper on which she had written a single, short word. "What does this say?" He froze, the denial already forming in his throat, the instinct for self-preservation screaming at him to feign ignorance, to retreat into the safety of assumed stupidity. But he met her gaze and saw the absolute, unshakable certainty there. She knew. To lie now would be to invite a punishment more creative and terrible for the deception. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He looked at the word, a simple, common word, and the part of his soul he had kept locked away and nourished in secret now felt exposed and vulnerable. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse from disuse in this context, the words feeling foreign and dangerous on his tongue. "It says, light," he whispered. The effect on the sisters was electric. Lillian drew a sharp, delighted breath, and Constance actually clapped her hands together softly. They were no longer looking at a strong back or a pair of capable hands, they were looking at a mind, a forbidden, cultivated mind, and the possibilities for their entertainment expanded exponentially. His hidden world of words, his private sanctuary, had been breached, and it was the greatest tragedy he could have conceived, for it transformed him from a simple object of physical torment into a complex playground for their psychological games. The shift was as palpable as a change in the weather, a new and colder front moving into the parlor's already frigid atmosphere. The purely physical demands, the moving of benches and the standing on stools, now seemed like the simple, honest cruelties of a bygone era. The discovery of his literacy had opened a deeper, more intimate theater for their amusement. The psychological torment began not with a shout, but with a whisper, a seemingly innocent question posed by Mrs. Albright as he stood before them the next evening. "Elijah," she began, her fingers steepled, "you can read. This means you can think. You can reason. This pleases us. It makes you a more engaging subject." The game was no longer about testing the limits of his body, but about mapping the contours of his soul, to see which parts would break first. The first true test of this new phase was a choice, a seemingly simple one. "In the ledger," she continued, tapping the blood-colored book, "we have noted 2 infractions from today. Old Thomas was too slow mending the fence. Young Sarah was caught with a ribbon she could not have come by honestly. One of them will be punished. You will decide which." The air left his lungs. This was a different kind of weight, one that no muscle could lift. It was a poison meant to be swallowed, a stain he would be forced to wear on his conscience. He stood silent, his mind racing down 2 terrible paths, both leading to the suffering of another. To choose Thomas was to condemn an old, weary man to a beating he might not survive. To choose Sarah was to subject a young girl to the lash for a moment of stolen beauty. The sisters watched him, their eyes alight with a clinical fascination, observing the minute play of agony across his face as if studying the struggles of an insect pinned to a board. "Your silence chooses both," Lillian murmured sweetly. He felt the words like a physical blow. Forcing a single, ragged name from his throat felt like a betrayal of everything he was. "Thomas," he whispered, the name tasting of ash. Mrs. Albright made a neat notation in the ledger. "Interesting," she said, without looking up. A pragmatic choice. The old for the young. The expendable for the potentially useful. You see, sisters, he does not merely read, he calculates. The victory was not in the punishment delivered to old Thomas, but in the one Elijah was forced to carry himself. They had made him complicit. They had forced him to navigate a maze of their design where every exit was a moral collapse, and they documented his every flinch, every hesitation, every shattered principle with the rapt attention of naturalists discovering a new species of pain. The parlor was no longer a room, it was a laboratory, and his conscience was their newest specimen. The ledger had always been present, a silent, ominous participant in their parlor games, but its origin had been a mystery, its plain leather cover giving no hint of the horrors it contained. Then came an afternoon when the air was particularly thick with the cloying scent of honeysuckle, and the sisters' boredom had reached a new, razor-edged pitch. Mrs. Albright, sensing the need for a grander gesture to elevate their entertainment, dismissed Lillian and Constance with a faint wave of her hand, leaving her alone with Elijah in the suffocating silence of the room. "It is time," she said, her voice devoid of its usual performative lightness, "for you to understand the legacy you are now a part of." She rose and moved to a tall, locked cabinet he had only ever seen the master open. From it, she drew not the ledger he knew, but its predecessor, its cover darkened with age and something else, a patina of handled malice. She placed it on the table before him, the sound a soft, final thud in the quiet room. "This," she explained, her tone that of a curator in a museum of atrocities, "is my grandmother's book." She was a woman of remarkable curiosity. She opened the cover, and the pages within were not filled with simple, cruel tallies, but with a flowing, elegant script that detailed things that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. Here were not just names and punishments, but observations, theories, and meticulous records of breaking points. Descriptions of how long a person could stand in a barrel of salt water, the effects of prolonged sleep deprivation on the will to resist, the precise number of drops of hot candle wax it took to elicit a scream. It was a chronicle of suffering refined into a pseudoscience, each entry a testament to a life used as a laboratory rat for the amusement of a woman with a quill pen. She believed that true understanding of one's property required a deep and systematic study, Mrs. Albright continued, her finger tracing a particularly ornate diagram that charted something unthinkable. She was a pioneer. We are merely her inheritors, continuing her work. She then closed the ancient book with reverence and placed it beside the current, blank-paged ledger. Our own volume has been lacking in such rigor. It has been mere accounting. But you, Elijah, with your mind, your resilience, you present the first true opportunity in generations to contribute to this family's scholarly pursuit. Your name will not be lost to history. It will be here, in this book, your reactions, your choices, your breaking point, all recorded for posterity. You are no longer just a diversion. You are our legacy. In that moment, the floor seemed to fall away beneath him. The personal, capricious cruelty of the sisters was a terrifying thing, but it was finite, tied to their whims and their breath. This book, this lineage of torment, was an institution. It was a thing that would outlive them all, a permanent record of his destruction, and his soul understood a new, profounder depth of horror. He was not just being tortured, he was being archived. The breaking point was not a scream, nor a sob, nor a desperate plea for mercy. Those were currencies the women understood, reactions they collected and savored. It was, instead, a silence. A particular, profound quality of silence that filled the parlor after a new and particularly vicious game. This one had involved a choice between two fellow slaves, a brother and sister, where the punishment for the one he did not choose was to be a permanent maiming, the loss of a hand, a life of incapacity. The women had laid out the terms with their usual clinical detachment, watching him, waiting for the calculation, the bargaining, the inevitable collapse. He had stood there for what felt like an hour, the weight of the decision crushing him, the air thick with the sisters' anticipation. But instead of the expected anguish, a strange calm had settled over his features. The struggle in his eyes, the internal war they so loved to witness, simply extinguished. When he finally lifted his gaze to meet Mrs. Albright's, it was not the look of a slave to his mistress, nor a victim to his tormentor. It was the look of a judge. His eyes, hollowed by exhaustion and suffering, held no fear, no rage, no supplication. They held only a cold, immeasurable, and absolute judgment. It was a gaze that saw not just the three women in their fine dresses, but the pathetic smallness of their souls, the rot festering behind the polished veneer of their civilization. It was a look that stripped them of their power, their status, their very humanity, reducing them to something vile and insignificant. For a long, breathless moment, the parlor was utterly still. The ticking of the clock was like a hammer against the silence. Mrs. Albright's face, usually a mask of composed cruelty, went slack with a confusion that quickly curdled into something uglier and more volatile. The faint, smug smile on Lillian's lips vanished. Constance looked away, a faint tremor in her hand. They had spent weeks trying to break his spirit, to find the limit of his endurance, and they had succeeded in shattering something, but what emerged from the wreckage was not a broken man, but something else entirely, something that refused to play its assigned role. He had, in that single, silent look, stepped outside the narrative of their game. He was no longer a participant, he was a witness, and his judgment was a verdict they could not bear. The power dynamic, the entire foundation of their entertainment, had not just been challenged, it had been, for one terrifying instant, completely inverted. The fury that began to burn in Mrs. Albright's eyes was not the hot anger of a slighted superior, but the cold, defensive rage of someone whose entire worldview has been fundamentally and irrevocably undermined. The descent was immediate and absolute, a chilling transformation from cruel sport to methodical sadism. The brief, terrifying moment of judgment in Elijah's eyes had extinguished the last vestiges of playful amusement in the parlor. What remained was a pure, unadulterated need to annihilate the defiance he had shown, to prove that his silent verdict held no power in their world. The shift was marked by a new, grim efficiency. Mrs. Albright closed the ledger and did not open it again during their sessions. The games of choice were abandoned. There were no more whimsical tasks or psychological puzzles. Now, the torment was direct, premeditated, and designed with a single purpose: to eradicate the man behind the eyes. It began with prolonged isolation in a lightless, airless root cellar, a space so small he could neither stand nor lie down fully, his world reduced to the feel of damp earth and the scuttling of unseen things. When he was brought back before them, pale and shivering, the questions were no longer about choosing another's fate, but about confessing to non-existent crimes, theft, insolence, plots of rebellion. His refusal to capitulate met not with frustration, but with a serene, terrifying certainty. They had moved beyond wanting a reaction, they sought dismantlement. The physical dimension returned, but stripped of all pretense of being a test of strength or endurance. It was simply pain, delivered with clinical precision. A lit candle was no longer a prop for a game, but a tool to be held against the skin of his hand until the smell of burning flesh mingled with the magnolia perfume. The whip was no longer an abstract threat for a hypothetical infraction, but an instrument applied to his back with a quiet, relentless rhythm, the sisters observing not with delight, but with the focused attention of artisans perfecting a craft. They spoke less, their communication reduced to glances and slight nods, a shared understanding that they were now engaged in a sacred, gruesome labor. The goal was to peel away every layer of his identity, his intellect, his defiance, until nothing remained but a raw, broken nerve. The parlor was no longer a stage for their entertainment, it had become a charnel house for the soul, and they were its quiet, diligent butchers, working tirelessly to reduce a human being to a testament of their own absolute, and ultimately fragile, power. The arrival of the new tutor, a young man named Arthur Pemberton from a modest family in Charleston, introduced a fragile, trembling sliver of a conscience into the house's corrupt heart. He had been hired to instruct Mrs. Albright's two nephews, and his world was initially confined to the sunlit schoolroom and the approved texts of Cicero and Latin grammar. His first encounter with the reality of Willow Creek was accidental, a wrong turn on his way to retrieve a book that led him past the half-open door of the parlor during one of Elijah's sessions. He did not see the worst of it, no whip, no candle, but he saw enough. He saw Elijah standing motionless, his head bowed, while Mrs. Albright circled him, her voice a low, venomous murmur detailing some failure of character or spirit. He saw the absolute stillness of the man, a stillness that spoke not of submission, but of a profound and terrible absorption of pain. He saw the faces of the sisters, not excited or amused, but serene and focused, like priests at an altar. The tableau lasted only a moment before he hurried away, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the image was seared into his mind. He became an unwilling accomplice not through any action, but through the crushing weight of his own fear and the complex calculations of his powerlessness. He was a hired hand, his position and the meager salary that supported his own family entirely dependent on the goodwill of the Albrights. To speak of what he saw, or even what he suspected, would be to invite instant dismissal, or worse, to be cast as a troublemaker, a northern sympathizer, his reputation ruined. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself he had misunderstood the scene, that it was a disciplinary matter, that the ways of such a grand plantation were beyond his understanding. But he could not escape the cold dread that settled in his stomach every time he heard the soft, firm order to bring Elijah to the parlor. He began to take different routes through the house, to avoid certain corridors at certain times, constructing a prison of willful ignorance around his own conscience. He saw Elijah occasionally in the yard, and the groom's eyes would sometimes meet his, and in that fleeting connection, Arthur saw no accusation, only a quiet, devastating knowledge of his complicity. The silence between them became a shared burden, a testament to the fact that the horror of Willow Creek did not only consume its victims, but also corrupted every soul who breathed its air and did nothing. Arthur Pemberton, with his books and his morals, became another brick in the wall of Elijah's confinement, his fear a louder and more powerful sanction than any overseer's shout. The fire began not as a roar, but as a whisper of smoke seeping under the door of the west wing long after midnight, a pale, ghostly tendril in the moonlit hallway. By the time the first shout of alarm pierced the stillness, it had already found its voice, a low, hungry growl feeding on dry timber, velvet drapery, and the varnished surfaces of 100 cherished cruelties. It moved with a strange, sentient fury, as if the very essence of the house had turned against itself, the heat and bitterness stored in its walls now erupting in a violent, self-immolating fever. The flames bypassed the schoolroom, ignored the master's locked study, and instead wrapped themselves with particular fervor around the parlor, that sacred space of psychological butchery. The windows of that room exploded outward, not from the heat, but seemingly from the force of the memories trapped within, showering the lawn with glittering shards and spewing a torrent of fire into the sky that lit the entire plantation in a flickering, hellish orange. The chaos was absolute, a screaming, frantic ballet of slaves forming bucket lines under the bellowed orders of the overseer, while the White family and their guests huddled on the far lawn, their faces masks of shock and terror, watching a significant portion of their wealth and history turn to ash. In the tumultuous shadows at the edge of the light, figures moved with a purpose that contrasted sharply with the panic, carrying water to save the kitchen and the smokehouse, the essential structures of survival, while the great house burned. It was in this chaos, amid the roaring of the fire and the shouting of men, that Elijah was last seen, not as a central figure in the drama, but as a fleeting shadow near the heart of the inferno. Some would later claim they saw him, for just a moment, standing motionless before the blazing maw of the parlor's French doors, his silhouette stark against the conflagration, as if bearing witness to its cleansing rage. Others would insist he was simply lost in the organized confusion of the bucket line. But when the sun finally rose over the smoldering, ruined husk of the west wing, the parlor was gone, reduced to a heap of blackened timbers and ash, and Elijah was nowhere to be found. The fire's origin was never determined, attributed to a forgotten candle or a stray ember from the hearth, but the timing of its birth, on the heels of the most brutal phase of his torment, and its specific, voracious focus, left a lingering, unspoken question hanging in the air, a question as acrid as the smell of smoke that would cling to the plantation for weeks. The legacy of the book became the central, unspoken ghost of Willow Creek, a haunting more potent than any specter of flesh and blood. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath of the fire, the official search was for Elijah, but Mrs. Albright's private, frantic obsession was for the ledger. She sifted through the scorched debris of the parlor with her own hands, her fine dresses stained with soot and ash, her eyes wild with a loss that transcended the destruction of mere property. The current ledger, the one that held the meticulous record of Elijah's torment, was nowhere to be found. It had not been reduced to a neat pile of cinders like the furniture, it had simply vanished. The possibility that it had been consumed completely was a hope that slowly curdled into a dread certainty that it had not. The fate of the book became a fissure that split the reality of the plantation. For the Albrights, it was a sword of Damocles hanging over their heads, a chronicle of their crimes that could have been carried away by the night, a document that, if it ever surfaced, held the power to unravel their entire world. It transformed them into prisoners in their own home, jumping at every unexpected visitor, scrutinizing every piece of mail, their cruelty now tempered by a pervasive, gnawing fear. For the slaves who remained, the book's absence became a different kind of story, a fragile seed of a legend whispered in the quarters after dark. The tale was not of a man who had simply run or perished, but of one who had stolen the master's words, who had taken the very proof of their sin and carried it out into the world. The book's unknown whereabouts became a silent, collective power, a testament that the White Lady's accounting was not final, that their history could be challenged, that the record of their evil was not safe in their hands. The charred ruin of the West Wing stood as a physical scar, but the missing ledger was the deeper, more festering wound, a void that held a multitude of terrifying and hopeful possibilities. It meant that the story of Elijah, and the stories of all those who had come before him in that terrible parlor, were no longer entirely owned by their tormentors. The truth was out there, somewhere, its potential to one day bear witness casting a long, cold shadow over Willow Creek, ensuring that the house, for all its attempts to rebuild and forget, would forever remain uneasily waiting for a reckoning that might still arrive.